It was 22 years ago that the streets of the Philippines capital, Manila, were filled with revolution. People power overthrew the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos and filled the air with talk of a new and representative democracy for the Philippines. But today, the Senate and the Congress remain packed with members of the same political dynasties. And the people still ask, is the nation's wealth just being distributed among the elite? I'm Taimur Nabili, and on this edition of 101 East, we ask, is the Philippines truly a democratic nation or just a lucrative family business? There are many who defend the system of political dynasties in the Philippines. They say the families bring a continuity and experience that is necessary for successful government. But the critics say that is demonstrably untrue. The economy here has been amongst the sickest in Asia for decades. The political system is ranked amongst the most corrupt in the world, and there are frequent military and civil uprisings. HYWEL Davis reports.
It's a country of startling inequality. Tens of millions of Filipinos live at or below the country's poverty line. In contrast, the richest 20% of the population have an income 14 times higher. Maria Diaz is one of those at the bottom. Along with her husband, a son, her sister and a niece, she lives alongside a railway track in the capital, Manila. Her tiny squatter shack built near the remains of other squatter houses knocked down by the government. She once lived at a larger house close to this site.
It hurt us deeply because a lot in our lives was lost. It was so hard because our jobs were here. Our space is now so cramped. Our sleeping quarters are so tight. It's hard to cook as well.
For many observers, the reasons behind such neglect of the poor lie squarely here, in the country's political system, which a small number of families have dominated since colonial times. The influential think tank, the Center for People Empowerment in Governance, says out of 265 members of Congress, 160 are members of political clans or dynasties. It says such dominance by a small number of elite families has caused grave problems for the country.
Their powers in Congress and their powers in the presidency are being used to enact laws and issue policies that cater to the basic narrow economic and political interests of the elite.
The roots of the dynasty system lie in colonialism. Immediately after World War II, the US gave independence to the Philippines. But half a century of American rule, after 400 years of Spanish, had already entrenched a feudal system where landowners dominated the lives of those beneath them.
Togetherness is such a vital aspect as far as my grandfather was concerned.
One family that has dominated post-war Filipino politics are the Aquinos. Congressman Benigno Aquino says the system meant that those with power and influence should help the less fortunate.
We have been raised to believe that we do have an obligation, especially to those who have a lot less than we do. And the idea of being, for instance, when we were small kids, one of the greatest sins was to be selfish. If you know, like any typical kid, you had candy that you so loved that you would tend to hoard it. And if you were seen hoarding it, you were forced to share it.
A simplified map of the Aquinos' most prominent political figures reveals a cast of senators, congressmen, and a president. A measure of the capacity of the dynasties to retain influence. But that has not meant stability. Senator Benigno Aquino's own father was gunned down by the Marcos regime in 1983. That prompted his mother's people power-assisted rise to the presidency.
The long agony is over.
Corazon Aquino's elevation was widely acclaimed as a decisive break with the Marcos regime. But for many, she was actually a symbol of the durability of dynastic politics after the Marcos hiatus. Key policies aimed at helping the poor, such as land reform, were hopelessly watered down as the governing elite closed ranks.
This program failed over 20 years because subsequently the Congress, represented by very strong families in owning ranches, called for the exclusion of livestock farms. Then those who were in fishing in forest areas, they also provided for exclusions.
The conviction that the families in politics are only concerned with their own interests is certainly one that has appeal in the poorer areas of Manila.
The politicians here, they all on the take. They do not see the poor people. All they see are the rich. Their only concern is to better themselves. In other countries, they make the poor a priority, but here the poor aren't.
Cynicism about politicians isn't confined to the Philippines, of course, but talking to people here in this slum district in West Manila, there's an almost total lack of faith in their political leaders. What people say here is that politicians are corrupt and their policies don't benefit the poor. For Maria Diaz, that certainly rings true. Despite the trains running just inches from her front door, she's trying to make a living selling household goods. Her main concern is her mentally ill son and his future.
I really just want to make enough for food, and I'm trying to save up so I can get proper care for my son to take him to hospital. That's really all I'm asking for, that I'll be able to get proper care for my son.
But as long as the interests of people like Maria remain so remote from those in power, any hope for a better future for her and her family seems a long way down the track.
Joining me to discuss the phenomenon of political dynasties in the Philippines are Professor Ben Lim, who's with the Ateneo University School of Social Studies. Alex Brillantes is the Dean of the National College of Public Administration at the University of the Philippines. And from the Senate of the Philippines, Senator Juan Miguel Zubiri. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for being with us. Ben, let me begin with you, if I might. Describe the phenomenon of the political dynasty and how far it extends into Philippines politics.
Well, if you speak of political offices in the Philippines, about 75% of the members of the Philippine Congress have relatives, grandparents, parents, wives, nephews, grandchildren who were former members of the Philippine Congress. If you go to the provincial government, the same pattern. Mostly governed. The politicians are mostly members of political dynasties.
So the concentration of decision making in this country is in the very, very small number of hands, which I guess goes against the idea of government of the people by the people.
That's right, because people who are members of the political dynasty who are elected to political positions are very popular, they have connections, and therefore it is their children who will win political positions when there are elections, and the poor people who have no money, no connections, do not get elected.
Is this, Alex, damaging to the Philippines politically, economically, culturally?
Even before we make a judgment whether it is damaging or not, I think we should be able to recognize the specific context of the Philippine political system here. One has to take into consideration the reality of Philippine politics here, and
which is?
You can't come up with a wholesale condemnation, if you may, of dynasties simply because a person is born into a political family. You immediately disqualify him from occupying a political position. I don't think that's right.
My question to you is, should we be condemning it or not? And I'm assuming you're saying we should.
No, certainly not. I mean, like I said, if we take a step back and be able to appreciate the specific context of the Philippine political system here. You have good and you have bad dynasties. You have good and bad politicians, just like anywhere, right?
You
are. I'm actually the center of this fire.
You are part of a political dynasty.
Yes, my father is the governor, my brother is the congressman. In a true democracy, the people are asked to choose who they want to lead a particular state, a particular city, a particular province. In this case, in a true democracy, there is dynasties. I mean, in the United States, we see the Bush dynasty, father and son and brother. We have the Clinton dynasty now, which is the husband and the wife. And we have several in true democracies, dynasties, even all the way in other countries such as India and other countries in South America and of course in Southeast Asia. The point there is, I agree with Professor Dean, Dean Brillantes, that there are good and bad dynasties. And in the Philippines, it's been proven before that the bad dynasties even lose. I mean, we have cases in the province of, in the north, the one dynasty was beaten by a newcomer, and just recently, the last election, another dynasty.
All right, there's a couple of points there, but first let me just get you to respond to those comments. What do you think of that argument?
Well, in the first place, when you belong to the political dynasty, you have all the connections and linkages, and therefore when the election comes, you have the money, you have the supporters, whereas any other member of the community, political community, who would like to get elected is disadvantaged from the very start, unless he comes from another elite or rich family who can contest. But if you speak of all the people in the Philippines, the electorate whose sector has to be represented, then you will find out that if they are not members of political dynasties, they are just out.
No, you know, Tamar, I agree with Professor Lim. I think all three of us here today will agree that we need, for example, campaign finance reform. We need a true party system. What's happening, and it's correct, in many provinces, it's just the elite who are controlling the political interest, because nobody can step up to the plate and fight this political elite. However,
is part of that problem not the fact that they're not allowed to because of this very dynastic system of which we speak?
Not really. It's just that they don't have the resources to do so. In a political finance reform agenda that we're trying to push, it's just like the reform agenda that it's just like campaign financing done in the United States, campaign financing done in Europe, wherein the state now will give a little bit of funding for the elected officials depending on political party. Therefore, a councillor now in my district, for example, in Mindanao, in Bukidnon, can run against my brother, and they'll be at equal footing with each other.
Well, there are many people would disagree strongly with all of that, but I don't want to concentrate on the fineries of the Philippine system. Let's put it in much broader sense here. As Ben was pointing out, what would your position be in a circumstance where your family interest conflicted directly with the interests of the people who lived in the province that you govern?
Well, again, at the end of the day, the vote is given to the people. The people decide. And if the people like the son of a politician there because he's well educated, they want to continue the projects of the father, then so be it. For example, many politicians now who took over from their fathers are better schooled, better trained, better equipped for the job.
So we'll have to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment or two to continue the conversation about Philippines' political dynasties. Stay with us.